What up, Photogs? Thanks for tuning in. Mike here from Photogs Unite. Over the weekend, Camille had asked about controlling your depth of field. So this week's video is about the 3 factors that control your depth of field. The first is the aperture value that you set in your camera. The aperture is the opening inside of your lens. So if you're at f1.2, f2, 2.8, you've got a really wide aperture. Tons of light comes in, but a narrow depth of field. Whereas if you stop that down to f16, f22, very little amount of light comes in, but lots of stuff is in focus. So how would you use this? If you're a portrait photographer, you generally want to shoot wide open, that f2.8, f2, 1.4, so just your subject's eyes are in focus and everything else is out of focus. That'll help keep the center of attention right in your subject's face. If you do landscape or architecture, you want to stop down to the f16s, the f22s. That way, the foreground, where your flowers or your animals are in focus, but the mountains and the sky in the background also remain in focus. The second factor that contributes to the depth of field is the focal length of the lens. So, the longer your focal length, the narrower your depth of field. So, if you have 2 lenses, both at f4, one of them is 200 millimeters and the other is 20. Even though they're both at f4, the 200 millimeter lens will have a much narrower depth of field than the 20 millimeter, which sort of leads us into our third factor, and that is your distance from the subject. If you're shooting that same 200 millimeter lens, you cannot shoot a portrait close up to somebody. You have to back up. So if you're up close, you'll just see into their mind or into the future. You cannot even fit them in the frame. It probably won't even focus. So you have to step back. Whereas if you shoot a wide angle lens, you can get pretty close generally. Most of my big sweeping epic environmental portraits are shot at f4 on a 17 millimeter lens. I'm only 3 or 4 feet from my subject. And because I'm so close, that gives me a really wide depth of field. So I have a wide angle lens, I'm really close, and even though I'm at f4, which isn't too wide open, it's still pretty open, I have a pretty wide depth of field and there's a lot of my image in focus. Now, if I want to do a portrait and blow everything out of focus except my subject, I want a longer lens, like an 85 or a 135 or that 200, and I'm going to back up really far, and then I'm going to open everything up. And that will totally give me a different image. And if I want everything in focus, then I'll stop everything down. So there you go. You want more in focus, then it's a higher aperture number. You move up closer and you shoot wider angle. If you want less in focus, you get a longer focal length, you back up, and you open up your aperture. So if you have any questions, feel free, post them in the message board or shoot me an email, and who knows, maybe it'll be next week's video. Until then, keep shooting and strive to be a better photographer.